What if I told you that there was a point in time when American cities were designed basically the same as European ones? A time when cars didn't dominate cities and you could actually walk places? Well, it's true. Up to the mid-20th century, cities like Baltimore, Cleveland, Detroit, and many more were known for their extensive streetcar systems and rail lines. But through the decades, they've slowly but surely been dismantled or abandoned in the name of car-centric city planning. It was a very deliberate trend too, one that took just about the entire country by storm. But on the other hand, when looking at cities in Europe, they've remained relatively clear of this design. So when and how did things go wrong in America? Well, it's hard to pinpoint the exact year America experienced this shift in mentality, but I place it around the 1920s as the decade that changed everything. Before that, people still viewed the streets as inherently belonging to pedestrians, and so there was no natural inclination to cede that space in any way over to this new mode of transportation. And sometimes even, people viewed cars as evil. Let me explain. In 1917, Detroit had 65,000 cars on the road, resulting in over 7,000 accidents and 168 fatalities. 75% of the victims were pedestrians. In the 1920s nationwide, 60% of automobile fatalities were children under the age of 9 playing in the street. The main cause of these deaths was excessive speeding and caused the public to view cars as evil. Car manufacturers effectively had a PR nightmare on their hands. Public fear and hatred ultimately meant a threat to automakers' profit, and this, ironically, is what started to change everything. In order to secure the place of their product on streets and people's money in their wallets, the auto industry began shifting the narrative through cunning methods of propaganda. It started in the 20s, with children being taught through school safety programs crafted by the auto industry that they must stop before they cross the street and let cars pass. They were also taught that they should stay out of the streets altogether, as streets belonged to cars, not people. This was a new sentiment, one that would be easier to instill in a new, younger generation. It also assured a future receptive market. This way, children would grow up with a planted idea of where cars were meant to be in society. But yet, a generation of adults were still not impressed. In fact, in Cincinnati in 1923, a referendum drive gathered over 7,000 signatures in support of a rule that would have required all vehicles in the city to have a speed regulator, limiting them to 25 miles per hour. The idea was that this concept could eventually be applied to all cities. It's at this point that the auto industry went into, for lack of a better word, overdrive. They knew that cars just wouldn't sell as much if there was a cap in place on their speed. With that in mind, the auto industry launched an aggressive campaign in order to make sure that the referendum wouldn't pass, and succeeded. Energized by this victory, automakers, dealers, and enthusiasts turned their attention to legally making streets the dominion of cars, not people. It was a genius move on their part, and a huge and forgotten loss for everyone else. So how was this orchestrated? It started by lobbying for traffic laws that structured where pedestrians could walk on the streets, shifting the narrative that cars were a threat, and began placing the burden of injury or death on personal responsibility. Soon after, auto industry groups took control of a series of meetings convened by then Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover to create a model traffic law that could be used by cities across the country. They ended up with the 1928 Model Municipal Traffic Ordinance, which was based on a traffic law in Los Angeles that enacted very strict pedestrian controls. This law stated that pedestrians could only cross at crosswalks and only at right angles, and it's basically the thing Americans are still living with today. To further legalize these laws, a more powerful tool was used: the invention of the crime jaywalking, and creating the shame that went with it. Relying on the idea that it would be more impactful for a person to be ridiculed and judged by their peers, the auto industry began planting the idea that walking wherever you wanted in the streets was stupid, illegal, and unsafe. Auto campaigners lobbied police to publicly shame transgressors and employ the use of whistles and shouting to draw attention to the person instead of quietly correcting them. They also staged safety campaigns where actors dressed in 19th century garments or as clowns would cross the streets illegally, implying that doing so was outdated and foolish. This was an aggressive method of rewriting the narrative around public spaces, and is also how the crime of jaywalking was invented. Just to clarify, to be a jay in that era meant to be someone who was a hick or a hillbilly, someone more backcountry that didn't know how to behave in a big city. So, pro-auto groups promoted the use of the word jaywalker as someone who didn't know how to walk in a city and threatened public safety. Next came the hijacking of the media. It started with controlling the news stories about car accidents. The National Automobile Chamber of Commerce, an industry group, established a free service for newspapers called the National Accidents Facts Bureau. Reporters could send in the basic details of an accident, and they would then be returned a complete article ready for print the next day. Of course though, the tone of the article shifted any blame on the driver of an automobile to the pedestrian, effectively rewriting the narrative that would permeate through American society to this day. Just to put all these effects into perspective, there were 1.5 million registered cars in the US in 1920. But by 1929, that number was over 20 million, and it only got more severe as time went on. By the mid-1930s, there was already one registered automobile for every 2 US households. Later, the media got better at promoting the importance of cars and even was able to help shift the culture of the entire country to one that emphasized individualism and the freedom of the open road. Car companies invested heavily in advertising campaigns that portrayed the car as an essential tool for achieving the American dream, and they used a variety of techniques to make their messages more appealing to consumers. A successful example of this was the "See the USA in Your Chevrolet" campaign, running from 1948 to 1961. The campaign featured catchy jingles, attractive images of cars and landscapes, and a message that emphasized the freedom and adventure that car travel could provide, helping to reinforce the idea that cars were an essential part of the American lifestyle, encouraging people to buy cars and take road trips. Another form of propaganda that manifested from this was the promotion of car infrastructure, such as highways and parking lots, as symbols of progress and modernization. This messaging helped to create a narrative in which car infrastructure was seen as essential to economic growth and development, and it led to policies and investments that favored automobile travel over other modes of transportation such as public transit or walking, which were made to be seen as less desirable. The media often framed transportation issues as problems of congestion and traffic flow, rather than issues of accessibility and equity. This all led to Congress passing the Federal Aid Highway Act in 1956, which provided funding for the construction of a national network of highways. It's been game over ever since. This system, 42,500 miles of major roadways across the US, crisscrossed through urban areas, in the process entirely destroying urban neighborhoods and entirely cutting off others. These cut-off areas morphed into suburbs, and if you think about it, the concept of a suburb is kinda crazy. They are entire neighborhoods, often without many amenities within walking distance, that are only accessible by car. It is quite a shift from the bustling, community-oriented public spaces of traditional human settlements. Anytime there was any controversy because of this, new media would be created to counteract it. Take for example in 1961, when cars were facing heavy criticism as plans for the new interstate system threatened to destroy or disrupt neighborhoods in many US cities, such as Interstate 95 in Miami. What resulted was the famous television show, The DuPont Show of the Week, sponsored by DuPont, who owned a 23% stake in General Motors, airing a story titled "Merrily We Roll Along: The Early Days of the Automobile," about America's love affair with the automobile. And these things seemed to work because it brought in a new idea about Americans and cars. From this point on, nothing really ever changed, and the America we know today is a result of this. But to be fair though, the idea of America developing their cities in the same way as Europe was highly unrealistic for many reasons. European cities are much older than American ones. They weren't built with cars in mind, and so they have tiny narrow streets fit for just pedestrians or single-horse carts. American cities just didn't have the same historical infrastructure and urban planning that many European cities had developed over centuries. Greater personal wealth in the US also allowed households to more readily afford cars than comparatively poorer European ones, particularly in the years immediately after World War II. And who can forget the fact that America is basically the same size as the entire continent of Europe? With the sheer vastness of the country, it was inevitable that cars would become much more important there than in Europe, because it was needed to get around. So, I mean, this was kind of expected to a degree. Regardless though, what we have now is simply too much, and it's exactly why America is starting, or at least trying to, shift towards walkable cities, like the 15-minute city concept, where people are no more than a 15-minute walk or bike ride away from all the services they need to live, learn, and thrive. The idea is appealing in its simplicity. It puts people and the environment at the center of urban planning. As for if it'll end up being implemented, or at least something similar, we'll have to wait and see. Thank you for watching.